think the chat is going to be filled with fireworks. So Dr. Ganesh, over to you, and it's your platform.
Sure. Thank you very much, Naveen, and pleasure meeting most of you again, because this is probably the third or fourth time I'm back in Time Mumbai. And it's always fun because we always get some amazing guests. But today I'm really excited. And the reason I'm excited is, how often do you meet a person who is, a phenomenal background in McKinsey, then started a company, successfully sold it, started another company in a completely different space, and has built a billion dollar valuation in the last, decade plus. So I think it's absolutely amazing. I'm looking forward to this chat with Rizwan as much as you are. And just as a quick background, I first met Rizwan in, I think it was 2002. And that was, I had left Aptech and moved from Bombay to Pune in 2001. And my long-term human resource head, a lady called Anuba, so she had also left and joined Rizwan's company, Transworks. And she's a great fan of mine and a great fan of Rizwan. And I'm sure she must be on this chat as well. And she said, look, you got to meet Rizwan because he's as similar to you as I can ever tell you. I said, my God, what is this going on? So I remember going to Powai and they were running this, he and Jagdish, his partner, were running this very interesting company called Transworks. We'll talk about that. And then, of course, 2 years later, they sold that company. And I thought now they would just start having fun. But instead, in fact, one of the first calls I think he made was to me. And he said, look, I remember the meeting. And can I come and meet you at home? And we still had a home in Bandra Bandstand. So he came and met me. We spent 2 hours in Bandra. We looked at all kinds of crazy ideas. And then he started this company, Citius, which is, I think, one of the success stories, to my mind, of the current generation. And we'll talk about that also. So Rizwan and I go back a long way. And I think even in the amazing work he's doing, he and his wife in Koita Foundation, I think, we probably do something there also. So it's been for me a friendship, an admiration for somebody very young who's been an entrepreneur. And what we'll do is what we normally do. So Rizwan and I will spend about maybe 30 minutes just having a conversation where I'll bring out the facets of his career and the success stories that he created with Transworks and with this company. And then we will kind of throw it open. So any of you have a question, feel free to pump it in. Or of course, we will have some time for, if you want to physically ask a question, we can do that also. So Rizwan, just tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is Rizwan Koita and what is your background?
Sure. So first of all, thank you to Time Mumbai for getting this organized. I was looking forward to the session. And it has been a while since I caught up with Ganesh, so this is a great way for me to do that as well. So let me do this. From my perspective, the objective of today's session is really to share we can obviously talk about what we have done, and often in life the good thing is that you try many things, but on your resume only the successes show up. So if you look at the resume of any individual, and it looks really phenomenal because people don't put down their not so successful things that they try to do, only successes show up. So most of our resumes look a little nicer than what they ought to be if they were more objective. But at least from me, the objective of today's session is to just have an open, candid, chat around my experiences of being an entrepreneur. What worked well, what didn't work well, so Ganesh, I look forward to the conversation today. In terms of my personal story, my personal story is as a kid I was very geeky. I liked maths and physics, and if everything had to go my way, I would have probably ended up being a professor in physics because I was really passionate about that growing up. But then at some point I went to IIT Bombay. I did electrical engineering there. Got a chance to go to MIT, so I actually became I have a master's degree from MIT, and I was a very good engineer. But for a variety of personal reasons, I wanted to come back to India. So I came back to India, and in the so I came back to India in 1995. So in 95, India was a very different country than it is today. And, the number of what I would say really interesting technical opportunities were far fewer than perhaps, someone of my background coming back to India today. And when I looked at the opportunities, somehow I looked at engineering opportunities because in some ways I was a good engineer, and I felt that that should be the natural thing for me to do. But I was not able to. I got 2-3 offers, but none of them were really exciting. They were with some of these large engineering houses. And then I also got this job from this company that I actually never heard of called McKinsey and Company. A friend of mine told me to apply to it because it was the so-called, hot company in the business schools in those days. They used to go to IIMs and pick up the.
But seriously, Rizwan, you hadn't heard of it. My God, my friend Noshid Kaka, you said.
But it was a very different world in 1995. The level of awareness of an engineering student was very different than what it was today. So I remember going to the interviews and they said, okay, so now next is going to be a case study, and I'd never heard the word case study as an engineer before, in some ways. So my first question to him is, hey, what's a case study? And then they first explained to me what a case study was, and then they asked me the case study. But long story short, I spent 5 years at McKinsey, and then I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur. And I was lucky that the whole world of, this at that time used to be called remote services, which was this whole ability to be able to work in India using, people to do, stuff which was slightly more, administrative in nature or call center work. Companies like GE and WNS and others had started doing it, but there were no third-party BPOs. So we started TransWorks, and we can talk more about that. And we were lucky to get the timing right. And we were probably amongst the first BPOs. And then I left TransWorks, and we can talk about why we did the transaction, etc. And then we set up Citius Tech. It's been 15 years that I've been running Citius Tech, and I'm here today. So that's sort of in a nutshell my personal background. And today I don't understand much about technology, but I still remember. And just for trivia's sake, my master's thesis was in at that time something which was very not very known, called machine learning. Okay, so in 1993 I had my master's thesis in this very esoteric thing called machine learning. And, unfortunately, I should have just stuck to that. I would have been more successful. So I'd completely forgotten about it. And for 10, 15 years after that, nobody spoke about machine learning. And now everybody wants to talk about AI/ML, right? And it's like the new fad. And I remember writing some of those, what is today just a press of a button on, TensorFlow and some of these online tools. In those days, you had to actually write all, utilities in, C and C++, because those pre-built libraries were not available, right? So from those days to now, I think a lot has transpired. And I ended up doing BPO work, and I should have actually been doing AI/ML work. Yeah.
So do you still have a copy of your master's thesis with you?
I'm sorry. I do have a copy of the master's.
I think you should now publish it, and we'll call you the father of machine learning.
Yeah,
So that's great.
Yeah,
but yeah. So just give me the chronology again. You joined McKinsey when from MIT?
From 1995 to 1999, I was at McKinsey about 5 years.
So then what was the defining moment of the move and setting up TransWorks? What made you do it?
It was interesting that being a management consultant, and McKinsey is a phenomenal place to work. And I often tell people that I probably learned more about being just at a human level, or as a manager, or in many ways, communication wise, I learned more at McKinsey than I probably learned in college. And it was just it's a very demanding environment. There's a lot of learning. Having said that, I always wanted to be an entrepreneur. And the problem was that in those days, if you looked at, and even today, McKinsey pays very well. But there are many other organizations that also pay very well in India today. You could be working in a hedge fund, you could be working in private equity, you could be working in investment banking. But in those days, McKinsey was like way at the top, and then anything else you would do, take up a job, would be like a third of that salary, or maybe a fourth of that salary. It was just, so leaving McKinsey had a massive opportunity cost, in some ways, So every year they would give me a significant raise. And then everybody around me would be celebrating that, hey, they got a massive raise. And I would come back to my chair, and I would look at that raise that I would have gotten. Those raises were like stupendous raises. You get 35, 40, 50% raises in those days. And I would look at that letter and say, oh my God, the task of becoming an entrepreneur has become even more difficult now, because the opportunity cost keeps on going up year on year. And then at some point I said, you know what, if I don't take the leap, then I'll probably not do it, you know. So then I had the conviction. I built an internal conviction to do it. And then, I would say even my wife was very nervous when we had just got married. So it wasn't an easy decision. But I think we were lucky that, it was good that we made that decision. Yeah.
But why BPO? Why Transworks?
So why BPO was, so to me, there was no BPO industry at that time, you know.
So you still probably had Pramod.
We only had captives. Only captives were there.
No, Genpact, you're right. Genpact would still have been largely
only captives. Only captives. Even Genpact, even what was GE's own Jekis, it used to be called Jekis at that time, right? It was an internal facility. WNS was just British Airways, outfit. There were no third parties. And to me, I was sort of more interested in it as the problem with being a consultant is that you become good in many things, but you don't excel in any one. So you can build a general understanding of different industries very quickly, you know, in some ways. But it's very hard to know something so well that we are able to go and start a company. So I had to look for opportunities of starting something which was a little bit of an open space, which allowed us to, get started and, maybe from first principles, think about, what kind of people you want to recruit, what should be the training guidelines, what should be the delivery model, et cetera, et cetera. And fundamentally, the BPO business is a simple business, especially if you were working with clients who are willing to teach you the specifics of the domain that you need to work on, right? Then it is a much simpler business to set up than in many other areas, I would argue, right? Which is also the problem with the BPO, that because it is simple, a lot of people got into it, which eventually led to the commoditization of the industry. But it was in some ways an interesting launching pad because there were not too many other companies in the space. And between me and my colleague Jagdish, with whom I'd started the company, we felt we had probably 6-9 months to figure it out, get your first customers, self-learn, because you couldn't hire anybody from the industry who knew anything. So it was an active self-learning exercise. And there was a certain advantage of being sort of, the first out of the block in a sense, which I think
what area of BPO did you choose, Rizwan? I mean, was there any specific focus, horizontal, vertical, anything?
So we initially no, because we were just being very opportunistic of looking at anything that came our way. We got a few lucky breaks, So we got a lucky break in online customer service with a firm that was just scaling up their online platform. In those days, chats and email support and all were becoming very important, So we started doing that kind of work. We got a couple of early customers in financial services who wanted to do certain back office activities, right? But it was literally, taking, carrying a bag, and this may be interesting for some of the folks on the line. The cost of telecom in those days, was 125 rupees a minute to make a STD call to the United States. So if you spent 1 hour on the phone, it cost you about 7,500 rupees. And this is 1999 rupees, by the way, 7,500. If you took a round trip ticket to New York, so you took a cheap ticket from Bombay to New York and you came back, that cost 28,000 rupees. So what that meant was that if you needed to be on the call for more than 4 hours, it was cheaper to fly to US, do those calls and come back. It was really expensive to do business development sitting in India, and I still remember, sitting with a Stopford because we were just self-funded at some point, And then he said, what, this is too expensive to make calls from India. So then I spent a few months in the US and then, got a couple of clients and then everything fell into place. Yeah. But it was interesting.
No, I'll just do a segue there because, interesting you mentioned that because 50% of the entrepreneurs I talk to are always, the dilemma is always, oh my God, US is our market. Do I go and settle there? Do I hire a guy? If I hire a guy, will he be successful? So how
Yeah.
how do you sell to the US? You said you went and spent time yourself.
Yeah.
Is that a model that you would advocate for entrepreneurs on this call?
So I would say for many industries, US is like the mecca, right? You
Correct.
crack or you win US customers, then you there's a lot of opportunity, but you also get spoiled. Then you can't serve Indian customers, right? So at Citius Tech, we got spoiled now, So I work with US healthcare customers. Now I can't work with Indian healthcare customers because now the delta between pain and reward is so skewed in the favor of US, right? Having said that, it's very difficult to think that as an entrepreneur, you are going to sit in Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, Chennai, wherever, right? And you're going to quote unquote hire high caliber talent in the US to sell something that you have not sold before yourself. Because the cost of hiring, I often ask people, right? I said, you've got a business plan. And in many industries or in many entrepreneurs are very good at factors like cost of production, right? So, they'll know that they're making a widget. What is the cost of the widget? What is the manufacturing cost? What is the margin, etc., right? Often what people don't realize is when I ask them a question, how many in-person meetings are required to close a deal? Now, again, this is business to business. This is not business to consumer. So I'm talking about in the B2B space. Now, imagine for your initial deals, you need 3 or 4 in-person meetings to close a deal. Now, that itself should, and it takes you on an average 3 to 4 weeks to set up a meeting.
Correct.
Then you know that in your industry, right, your typical sales cycle, best case is going to be 4 to 6 months. So doing some of these back of the envelope math, right? And then the cost of a sales guy, how many such meetings can you do in a month? Practically, right? He's not going to be on the road every day. And every day he's not going to visit, Los Angeles and do 6 meetings. So he's probably going to do 2 meetings, right? If you just do the back of the envelope math, you'll realize that the cost of sales in the US can become very high. And it is very high when you know what you're doing. When you don't know what you're doing and you have never done it yourself before, then to expect a person whom you're going to hire cold in the US market, who's going to have the ability, the motivation, and the commitment, right, to be able to do this on your behalf without having an existing sales model in place is very difficult. Yeah.
Sure.
So I would almost say that, there is, as an entrepreneur, there is probably no shortcut to trying and doing it yourself, learning how to do it, improvising that process very quickly, and then establishing a model that you can hire somebody to follow.
Got it.
But it's hard to hire somebody as a sales guy to create a model, because you won't get that. Even if that talent exists in the US, they're definitely not joining an Indian startup. Yeah. They've got too many other, high profile companies that they are going to be working in, right? So that is a real issue. Yeah.
Got it. So back to TransWorks. I mean, you literally ran the company for what? 4 years totally?
4 years. Yeah.
In that 4 years,
in
that 4 years, what kind of revenue did you build up?
So revenues, in those days were not very large, but we had gotten to about 1,700 individuals, about 1,700 individuals when we sold the company. Yeah.
So why would you sell the company at that stage? What was the motivation?
So what had happened, Ganesh, and it was actually a very obvious decision for us. I'll tell you why that was the case. In 1999, when we started the company, we were amongst the first 5 BPO companies out of India. And then across 2000, 2001, 2002, that entire industry changed in complexion. So what was supposed to be a new innovative industry became an industry where there were literally hundreds and thousands of people who some form of fashion were doing something in the BPO space. The big guys came into it, all the big guys, Infosys, Wipro, TCS, obviously the Accentures of the world and all. And then it seemed to us that the whole BPO industry the business model was such that it was very hard to differentiate with the crowd. So where this differentiation happened, the differentiation was happening at scale. So, if you are competing against Wipro or Infosys or whatever, then they would say, hey, I've got 20 locations across India that I could do it. And, as TransWorks, we had three locations across India, right? Somebody would say, hey, I've got, 7,000 people working. Somebody says, I've got, 2,000 people working, Somebody says, I'm going to give you X dollars per hour. Somebody says, okay, I'm going to give you X minus whatever, $0.5.
Getting commoditized to a large extent.
So the differentiators was no longer around things. It was all around scale and it was all around pricing. And it seemed to us that, the margin profile would continue to decline. And that business needed a lot of capital because, every time you set up a seat in those days, and I don't know what the number is today, we had to spend about $10,000 a seat for a voice seat, because you would have the infrastructure cost, but you would have the telephony cost, you would have the dialer cost, you will have the CRM tool. It was expensive, and it would take you a while on a low margin to recover the cost of the investment, So net between our investors, so we were funded by this firm called Chris Capital, and we were amongst their early investments. So between us, we decided that it was better owned by a larger organization that had the ability to continuously put in capital, because on a lower margin, if it's very capital intensive, you have to constantly raise money, in some ways. So then we ran a process, and the Aditya Birla Group, they bought TransWorks. And that company continued to grow. I think I would say it was a modest acquisition.
They already had Minax and they brought TransWorks.
No. So what happened was they acquired TransWorks.
Okay.
Then TransWorks acquired Minax.
That was in Canada.
That was a Canadian outfit where, they saw an opportunity. And then the merged entity, because Minax was larger and had a better brand recall in the US market, they felt that the merged entity should be called Minax. And then that's how it became Minax. Yeah. But in my mind, on hindsight, the timing was right. And if you look at what has happened in the BPO business in India, what has happened is that lots of companies have built scale, but the value creation has been modest, because it continues to remain very competitive. You continue to see, skill issues, attrition issues. Even voice, I believe, countries like Philippines and others have given India a run for its money. So Indian BPO firms have, in some ways, been successful in doing a lot of work, but their ability to charge a premium or to, be, innovative has got compromised because the customer doesn't think of it. The customer always thinks of it as a cost per call, $1 per hour, so they tend to drive commoditization by the way the services are rendered and the way the services are bought.
Well, let me ask you a last question on BPO, and then we'll move to CTS, which is the story. When I talk to people like Keshav Murugesh, for instance, or even Tiger Tyagarajan, their theme is that, look, the reason why they are better valued than other competitors in the BPO space is because, they understand the process of the customer better, probably even better than the IT counterparts. And they are now heavily into analytics, etc., etc. So, yes, as I said, last question on BPO. Do you think that's really the future, that people move away from the commoditized voice business into more value-added services? Or is that just a euphemism of saying
No, I'm sure that will happen. The other thing which they will, and again, I'm been out of this business for 15 years, right? Yeah. So whatever I say, you should take it with a pinch of salt. I would say that areas like automation and AI, right, are going to take away a lot of the heavy manual processes, both on the administrative side as well as even on customer service, right? So today, for example, you could develop a very, very effective robotic response capability on your chat, and therefore what's going to happen is that the human involvement, whether it's processing of information or whatever, right, is slowly and steadily going to get automated. Now the question really is the automation going to be driven by the BPO vendors, where they will be able to capture some of the arbitrage? They'll obviously have to pass on a lot of the benefits to the customers, right? But they can retain some of it. Or is the automation or the innovation going to be happening at the customer's end, which will then onward reduce volumes for the BPO firms.
Sure. I think
You know, so
that's-
that's an interesting one, and I think it'll depend on the company by company. Only challenge what happens is that when you are used to a certain services revenue, and when you try and automate it, then you may increase your margin, but it does come at a very significant revenue cannibalization. You know, so that is it's a bitter pill to swallow for.
And I guess if you don't cannibalize your revenue, somebody else will cannibalize it.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
Okay, so now let me come back to you. So you sold off Transworks to the Birla Group, and then you walked away into the sunset. And then why CTS? Why healthcare?
So when we were looking at our next gig, we looked at many different things that we could potentially be doing. And at some point we realized that, between the couple of us, between Jagdish, myself, one of the things we'd become good at was the ability to deliver high quality services with an offshore cost model. So that was the core thing we had learned. But what we all had also learned is that you try and do something which is easy to replicate, which was the case in the BPO space. Then over a period of time, it gets commoditized. So we asked ourselves the question that what kind of things could we be doing where there is a offshore cost advantage, but the nature of the service offering is reasonably complicated, where we can build and sustain a competitive advantage. And as we looked at the space, there were a couple of friends that we knew, including one of my co-founders. His name is Bimal Nayak, who's also actually a friend of ours from IIT Bombay. We got together and we felt very excited about healthcare and healthcare technology, because we felt that it would be interesting to build a business that focuses purely and exclusively on healthcare, because healthcare was, one, a complex domain, two, the underlying elements of what it takes to do technology work, right, requires you to become familiar with many things which are very unique to healthcare. Understanding of healthcare data standards, security, privacy, reasonably complex workflows between payers, providers, life science companies, regulatory environment, which tends to be, unique to healthcare. So healthcare was reasonably complicated, and we didn't see any of the other IT companies, and there were hundreds of IT companies even in 2005. The IT industry was fairly well established. We didn't see anybody having that passion or the drive to build expertise in that vertical. So we felt that if we took our learnings of doing, having a very strong, offshore delivery model in a space that was less penetrated, in a space which was reasonably complicated, and if we could become good at it, then we would be able to, command a premium, build a competitive advantage, and be able to build a successful business. And the good thing about healthcare, and most of us know that, is actually very large. So while it's niche in some ways, healthcare itself is about, depending on which country you look at, between 15 to 18% of most developed countries. So there's a large business opportunity if you become good at that. So that was our hypothesis.
When you guys defined your healthcare canvas, did it go all the way from payers to, like, say, insurance companies to hospitals to including pharma? Was that your canvas?
So we looked at it differently. We looked at it like we want to become good in a patient data.
Okay.
So wherever patient data will exist and you need to do tech work on patient data, we will do it. Because you could be working for a hospital, but then the hospital may have needs in their finance and accounting. They will have needs in their ERP. They will have needs in their HR system. Lots of needs are there, right, which have nothing to do with patient data. So we defined our focus within CTS Tech to say, hey, CTS Tech is going to be in the business where we will build deep expertise in anything to do with technology and patient data.
Which will include the insurance policy.
So any processes in the insurance companies that deal with patient information, that we will do. So even, for example, we're working with life sciences companies, then we will do work around their clinical trials and pharmacovigilance and real world evidence, which are all activities of pharma companies which need them to manipulate and manage a large patient data. But a pharma company will have massive investments in ERP, sales and marketing, supply chain, lots of those, manufacturing.
So you wouldn't get into that.
We won't get into that because it doesn't touch patient data, and then we would position ourselves as this company that has deep expertise in healthcare and, patient information.
See, Rizwan, when I was talking to you earlier, you also said that, look, there's a difference between being a tech horizontal company and posing as a healthcare specialist and being a true health tech company. You said the difference between you and the others is you're a true health tech company. Can you define?
Yeah.
Because we all think we are domain specialists for today.
So one of the most misused, depending on how you see that word, is domain expertise in the industry, right? Because everybody is a domain expert. And the problem is that we look at domain expertise as having 5 amazing slides in the sales deck, right? So if you can get your marketing team to put together 5 really good slides, what the source maybe doesn't matter, but you get 5 slides, okay? And you can add it to your deck, and then you can deliver the 5 slides and you're a domain expert, okay?
And ideally show one doctor.
And have one doctor, okay? What we did, and this was, I think one of our success factors, okay? When we were building Citius Tech, we agonized over the fact that what is it that we will need to do to truly become good in the domain, and not just have 5 slides. And we came to a conclusion that we had to do 4 things really well if we wanted to truly convince ourselves first and then our customers that we were a domain expert in healthcare. Okay. So first, as we said, is that we need to be able to, we are not going to be able to hire people from the outside. Because guess what? If we are the only game in town who are experts in healthcare, then we cannot hire great technology guys with healthcare experts because they don't exist, right, in some ways. So it becomes our responsibility to have the framework in place to take strong technology people and groom them in the business of healthcare. Obviously, everybody's not going to become a PhD in medical imaging and medical devices, but you need to build enough for them to offer a differentiated level of sophistication to the customers as they're engaging with, top, healthcare technology companies, hospitals, etc. So the question is, what is it that we need to do? And the nature of the work you do in healthcare, it may sound like one thing, but there are tens of subparts in healthcare, right? So for example, medical imaging is a subdomain by itself, right? So being good in medical imaging and radiology workflows, then you have to be good in, X-ray, MR, CT, a lot of stuff, right? Genomics is its own a world by itself, right? And how is genomics data captured? What is the structure, etc. You could be doing labs and pharmacy and stuff like that. You could be the departmental systems. So, for example, emergency department systems are very different from departmental systems required for other like cardiology or nephrology or neurology or what have you. So, each of the subdomains in healthcare actually are, in a sense, they have their own complexity, their own sophistication that is required, right? Now, as a startup, we couldn't do all of that in one shot, but we created a framework within Citius Tech of how we are going to, each time we win a new customer, how are we going to codify the knowledge and create repeatable training content. So today at Citius Tech, and it's evolved over 15 years, if somebody came to my office, we would open up our training portal. And I can tell you that we have the world's largest healthcare technology training content that you can find. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that was that we built the framework 15 years back. And then each time we got the opportunity to build it's like a jigsaw puzzle, right? It's like a 1,500 piece jigsaw puzzle that each time we needed the piece we built. We did it for the customer, but then we retrofitted it so that it went and fit into our training framework. So over a period of time, we built so much of depth in it that now when a new person joins Citius Tech, I can create a guided learning path for that individual to become good in the business of healthcare. So, much like you join Mumbai University, right? And you want to do a master's program in psychology, then there are some base courses, and there are some additional courses, etc., etc. You do the same thing if somebody joins CityStech. We would create a guided learning path for that individual to become good. Now, when we show that to our customers, there's a wow element to it. Okay, because they can say, hey, you know what? We know what CityStech means when they talk about domain expertise. So that's one dimension.
So your customers don't ask you to license your jigsaw puzzle to them so that they can learn more about their own business?
What we do is these days, we give the relevant slice of information to our customers for free.
Okay.
Because we want our customers' own employees to get trained on CityStech content.
Oh, okay.
Then who is CityStech is entrenched in the minds of all their technology team members, right? Because they have learned healthcare on the CityStech technology courses, right? So training and certification is one dimension.
This is the McKinsey in you coming through in CityStech.
It is very similar in McKinsey, you know. So in some ways, right, McKinsey also does something very similar, right? In some ways, how does McKinsey? In fact, it's the conceptual framework is just taken directly from what a McKinsey type organization would do.
Correct.
Okay. The second, so this is very tangible. So I'm answering. It's going to be a long answer, but this is very important for the audience to understand, right?
Sure.
So one dimension is training and certification, where it's just not talk, but it's something real, right? The second thing, right, is client work. So when you do client work, then you should be able to encapsulate in terms of case studies and value add documents or whatever, right? So that those become interesting artifacts, which are real artifacts that you can put in front of incremental customers. The third thing is publications. It matters a lot, right? So, you know, you go to my website, you know, citiestech.com, and you'll find that, you know, CityStech team members are writing an article in some publication, they're presenting in a certain conference, whatever, right? Because those are external validations of stuff that CityStech is doing. And you, by the way, you'll never find an article written by me, because I'm not smart enough to write some of those articles, but I want to make sure that there are enough people within the organization who are publishing in the outside world, where my clients and prospective clients can look at it and say, you know what, now we know why CityStech. So that's the third dimension.
Again, reinforcing the guru image.
Yeah. And the fourth is awards, right? That you apply for awards, right? And, you know, when you apply for many awards, you win some, you know, in some ways, okay? So those are the four things that we told ourselves that if we can do all these four on a consistent basis, then we'll be able to demonstrate to somebody that we are a domain expert in healthcare.
So let me get this right. It's
now obviously,
it's customized.
Now there's a fifth dimension, which is, you know, hiring some very specialized talent. So that also we did, right? In some ways, you know, so going back to your point, Ganesh, you know, hiring a few doctors and all of that kind of stuff. So that we did, right? So it's a combination of these 5 things that we've done systematically to be able to, you know, create that wedge between ourselves and a very commoditized IT services business, you know, in some.
But that's a great story. So just to repeat what you just said. So you're saying building great customer cases, building that jigsaw puzzle of training content for your own people and for externals, making sure that you're doing a lot of research and a lot of publishing, getting awards and getting specialists on board. So
exactly. Yeah.
That's awesome. I've never heard it said that way. That's very, very interesting.
Because I look at myself and say, if I were a skeptical client or a prospective client, right? How do I convince you that it's just not 5 slides in a sales deck? There is something deep to it, you know, in some way. So I have to work really hard to demonstrate that differentiation, you know? Yeah.
So given this and given the phenomenal capability that you and Jagdish and I'm sure Bimal also has, couldn't you have grown faster than you have grown in terms of revenue?
You know, we could have, but we wanted to be self-funded. So one of the things, right, we and this is again, you know, as an entrepreneur, many times you have to make trade-offs. So for the first 8 years, so we started the company in 2005, until 2014, we had no external funding. It was self-funded. So what exactly happens when you're self-funded? You have to be very disciplined. So we were still growing at 30, 40, 50% a year. So it wasn't because we had started from zero in revenues in 2005. And we had grown to about, you know, 60 odd million. I don't know what the rupee was, but it was about a 400 crore company, you know, in some ways, right? Over an 8-year period. Okay. So that itself is not bad. Okay. But we could have grown faster. So imagine, for example, we had taken an alternate strategy that after first 2 years or 3 years, we had gone and taken a lot of private equity or venture. Then the natural thing for us would have been that, hey guys, it's too conservative. There's such a large market opportunity. Why don't we go and hire 5 more sales guys? Let's crank it up, right? We could have gone down that path. But, in hindsight, it was fun. And, we were very happy to be running the business our way. We were very disciplined. So it's not like, we were having fun. We were having fun and working very hard.
So why did you take that first round of funding in whatever, 2012, 13, whenever it was?
So the first round of funding, General Atlantic came in. And at that point, we didn't need any money. We were very well capitalized. I think I mentioned in the public that when we raised capital, we had 40 million of cash sitting in our books. So we didn't need to bring any external investor, in some ways. So the reason we brought an external investor was very simple. At that time, we had got to a point where we wanted to. So we were running like a professional company, but we didn't have a formal board. The board was just a bunch of 3-4 of us who were part of the founding team. We had attracted good local talent, but for us to attract talent in the US and other places it becomes harder to do that if you don't have any external funding.
Okay.
And you start appearing. I'm going to use a word here. You appear like a desi company in some ways, right? So how do you change how do you become an international company? And part of becoming an international company was to have the ability to be able to attract talent and people on the board and as employees who probably would need that additional level of comfort that, yes, there was strong backing. So we raised funding from General Atlantic. They put in about 110 million. It was a secondary transaction, so the company didn't need money. So we were able to achieve that objective. So
what was the assessed valuation at that time?
We were valued at a little north of 300 million at that time.
Now tell us about the 300 million to 1 billion. What was the magic in the next 7 years?
So I'll just take a moment to finish.
Yeah, please.
So one of the things we had to formalize the company, right? So if you look at my board of directors, for example, right, we brought on some senior folks in the board. Okay. The gentleman who now is the chairman, and it's all on my website, so somebody can go and have a look at it. So if you look at my board of directors today, the chairman of my board is a gentleman called Dr. Bill Winkenwerder, and Dr. Winkenwerder, he's a very, very senior gentleman in the US healthcare. He used to be the chief executive of Highmark, which is a $20 billion healthcare company out of Pittsburgh. So we were able to attract folks like him on our board because we had General Atlantic, who was an investor in our company. We were able to hire some very senior talent in the US as a consequence of that. So we were able to achieve that objective of taking a company that had become reasonably successful, but just creating more formal structures of the board of directors and all of that, right, in some ways to be able to take it forward. Yeah.
So then tell me the last 7 years. So what took you from the 300 million valuation to
So 2014.
A lot of questions on the chat are about how did the unicorn happen?
Yeah. So 2014, we were at about 300 odd million, in some ways. And in 2019, General Atlantic had spent about 5 years, so that's typically their average investment holding period. So they came to us in at the start of 2015, and they expressed a desire to monetize their stake. They felt that it was a good time. In fact, we were on pre-COVID, we continued to be on a very strong wicket. So we were growing at about 20-25% year on year. So we felt that they were exiting the business a little premature. They could have waited for another 1 or 2 years. They would have made a better return. And but they felt that it was a good timing, and we ran a process. Now, what happens, Ganesh, and you run big companies, so there is an amazing power of geometric compounding. That things just naturally keep on increasing. So it's not like from $300 million to $1 billion valuation, it became 3x, right? It's not like we were working 3x harder, right? We were doing the same stuff, but the power of compounding is so strong that once you achieve a certain critical momentum and then you keep on growing at that 20-25% compounding, right? Then very quickly, first of all, a lot of people on my team had stock options, so they all did well the last time. But when they sold their stock options for, sort of 300 million valuation and they made a lot of money, we gave them more stock options because now we had to retain them for more years, right? So there was a lot of skepticism. Itna high valuation pe agar stock options mila hai, so how much more will it get to, in some ways, and 3 years, 5 years go by, and you see that a company which was $60 million company now is a $200 million company, right? And we got a much higher valuation. Now we are giving stock options at $1 billion, and now there is skepticism. It's already $1 billion now. How much more can it be? And even I was skeptical till 2 days back, and now I'm not skeptical anymore.
Why?
So the question is, what has happened in 2 days? In the last 2 days, Happiest Mind has gone public.
I know.
Yeah. And Happiest Mind has got a market capitalization of 5,500 crores. And Happiest Mind is half my size. And far less profitable on a percentage basis.
So now you're aspiring for 2 billion.
So, I don't know, but I'm saying that, the world is crazy, and not my revenues, obviously, because of COVID and all, we got impacted, but, and so has, I don't know much about Happiest Mind. So it is not a comment on Happiest Mind at all, right? It's much more a comment on the power of geometric compounding and the power of size, and just things just happen, after a point. Yeah. So, and this is very positive for budding entrepreneurs, that life may seem like a huge struggle to get from 0 to 10. But then if you're doing well, 10 will become 20 and 30, and at some point you get to 100 and you will look back and say, oh my God, now I'm at 100, and it is unimaginable what happens with the passage of time if you just be at it. Yeah. I'll give you another story. Okay. There used to be in fact, I'm going to use his name also on the call, make it more interesting. Okay. Everybody knows Rajan Anandan. Okay. Because, he's a big, angel investor, he used to be at Google till very recently. And just for trivia, he was my first manager at McKinsey. So in the 5 years I spent at McKinsey, when I joined McKinsey as this new associate, the first project I was on, he was my engagement manager. I was the associate. He was my direct report. I was his direct report. And he's an amazingly bright guy. And, at that time he was amazingly bright as well. Right. So I had the opportunity of working with him directly for a year. And then I've known him as a friend for many years after that. So when we had just started Citius Tech, and we were about $2 million at that time, we were just thinking about ideas and reaching out to friends and people that we knew. So I called him once, and I spoke to him, and I knew he had started investing in angel companies and all. He's saying, Rizwan, tell me one thing. Okay. Do you think the company has the potential to become $50 million? And I said, Rajan, to be very honest with you, it will grow from 2, but I don't think it can become so large, because, when you're running a $2 million revenue company, right, then that 20, 30, 50 looks like an impossible dream. Koi chance hi nahi hone ka. How can you become 25 times your size when you're struggling so much at $2 million, And then this magic of geometric proportions come into the picture, So you keep on doing the same thing day after day, month after month, year after year, and interesting things start to happen, and it just goes there. So that you have to live through it to know it. It just my saying it doesn't help, but I just want to let everyone know that there is a magical power of compounding.
So what is next for Rizwan and Jagdish? You've been there, done that 20 years.
We are running the company. There is nothing next right now.
more geometric compounding.
Happiest Mind has given me a new lease of excitement. I'm the happiest guy as a consequence of that news. Let's put it like, I'm just joking, but but there's a lot of opportunity.
You think
the stuff that we are doing right now, right? It may seem like, hey, you guys are already at 200 million or whatever we are, right? But in each of the things we do, we are still scratching the surface.
Okay.
Right. So for example, if you're working with health insurance companies, right, it's not like if there are 150 large health insurance companies, we are working with 5 of them, or 10 of them, If there are 100 to 150 large hospital systems, we work with 10 of them, So the market opportunity for the stuff that we are good at, Ganesh, is very large. Now, obviously, very large doesn't mean it's easy. It will still need the grind and hard work and perseverance and all of that, right? But CTS Tech, in terms of just the business opportunity, is very large.
So there's a question that's come on the chat line saying that, look, so, I mean, have you considered going outside the US and doing similar stuff in Europe or Japan?
Yeah.
Not cross your
Yeah. We have tried, but it's been very hard for us. Yeah. Okay, it's an honest answer. And I'll tell you why it has been hard. Okay. Part of the reason it has been hard is because what happens is, as an entrepreneur, right, you want to, okay, let me just step back. I'll start over again. In any market, for you to sell something, you need to have a certain presence, especially if you're selling something which is valuable. Now, if you're selling something which is very low value, then maybe not as much. But anytime you're selling something of any value, then people will only trust you if you have a presence. If you don't have a presence, then somebody is going to really feel worried about writing a big check and making a commitment, because they say, this company is there today. We are their first company customer, but what will happen after 3 years if they don't have a presence here? How will they support me? What kind of a relationship am I building?
It's a bit of a chicken and egg.
It's a chicken and egg, right? So what ends up happening is that you need a certain level of critical mass to establish a presence in a geography. Now, the reality is that there's always going to be a first geography that you want to make entry. And that needs incredible amount of entrepreneurial energy and sheer grind so that you get a few lucky hits, right? Otherwise, no company or no entrepreneur should ever succeed, right? Because nobody ever has a history. So you need that massive level of entrepreneurial energy in any new thing that you're doing in a new market. Okay, because you don't have an existing presence, you don't have references, right? So most important thing is you want to have a reference. So you're hiring somebody senior. The most important thing is, hey, can I connect to this guy via a common friend who will say good things about that guy? If you want to buy a product, then hey, which are the other 3 companies that I know? If you say, hey, you know what, I'm trying to, I often give the example of an unknown country in Africa. Imagine somebody came to pitch to me and said, Rizwan, this is an amazing widget. It sells so well in Nigeria. Therefore, buy it. And it's very expensive. I won't buy it because I don't know anybody in Nigeria. I can't make a call and validate it. Who knows if the Nigerian company is going to will make another flight to Mumbai afterwards, or they will just disappear with my money, A typical US customer will have the same level of apprehension working with an Indian company as we have about a company in Zimbabwe or Nigeria or Cambodia or any other country that we are not very familiar with, So what has happened is that we have made many half attempts in different geographies, but we have not made the level of commitment that was required to establish a presence.
Plus, you have a huge white spaces to be addressed in the US.
Yeah, and then what happens is, as a CEO, right, you often ask yourself the question that I've got so much of opportunity.
Yeah, exactly.
My $100 of revenue with a certain effort can become 125, 150 with a very clear line of sight. Now with that, do I want to hamper that by trying to earn $2 and $3 in a new geography like a UK or a Germany or a France? Okay. So odds are, Ganesh, that at some point we will be having presence in those geographies, but we may go down an M&A route, or we may go down some other strategic partnership route, right? I don't think the presence in those geographies will come through the same way as we did in the US, which is you put one sales guy or 2 sales guys, they will go around hunting. That approach will not work now for CTS Tech because it's too incremental and with no clear visibility. And I'm sure you faced similar things in Zensar as well. I would love to hear your answer for Zensar actually, Ganesh.
Geometric progression, as you said. You're right, actually, because when you grow from 40 million to 100 million, there's a certain market perception.
Yeah.
100 to 300 and it changes. 300 onwards, it's like, just rockets.
Correct.
Our stock price went up 45% per year for the last 5 years I was CEO.
That is correct. Yeah.
Geometric part.
Yeah, that is correct.
There's an interesting question from Dilip, and it's a good question saying that, look, now that you're looking at maybe acquisitions, maybe substantial growth, so would you and Bearings consider listing the company at some point of time? Is that part of the...
Yeah, we would. I mean, there's no near-term plan, but at some point we would do that. Yeah.
So that's a possibility. And another interesting question, I think, from Sharda here, saying that, look, was there any impact of the 2007 recession on CTS Tech? And by extension, how does COVID impact you?
2007 was the best year ever as a company.
How come?
And the reason for that was that because, it was very localized to financial markets. Yeah. And we were a small company, and we just, healthcare and the work that we were doing. I don't want to take a digression here, but there were many important regulatory changes that happened in 2007, 2008, 2009 in the US healthcare market. And what that did was, if you guys know that Obama, when he became president, he had a huge problem. The first time he became president, he had a huge problem of fixing the economy, which was broken. And he doled out a lot of money to different sectors. And one of the sectors that was a beneficiary of that was the healthcare sector. And he made some very profound changes in the law, which mandated hospitals and other healthcare organizations to embark on the path of clinical electronic medical records and gave a lot of incentives. So that boosted a lot of investments in technology. Now, as far as COVID is concerned, the answer is yes, we did get impacted. But we work in 4 sectors. We work with large hospital systems, and around the world, hospitals have been much like, when we talk about impact on industry, everybody understands hotels and restaurants and travel. I think a lot of people fail to recognize that healthcare is one of the sectors which has got really badly hit by COVID. The impression is, all the hospitals are full. No, all the hospitals are only full during COVID, right? And providing emergency care for COVID. But all other fields of healthcare, nobody wants to visit a dermatologist. You only want to go to a dentist if you're in serious trouble. You have chest pain, you are unlikely to go to the hospital. You'll say, "Arey, pata nahi, abhi kal nahi rahega." Normally you would have gone and met your cardiologist, right? If you're having a headache, you will not want to go to meet a neurophysician. So all other areas of healthcare have actually gone on pause because of the excessive focus on one set of problems, which is COVID. So healthcare in general as an industry has got very badly impacted globally.
Post-COVID or even during COVID, do you see telemedicine as a big opportunity where you can have a significant play?
Yeah, so telemedicine itself is going to become huge in going forward. Okay, because what has happened is, and again, I can spend a lot of time on this, but in short, right, I won't talk about India because India healthcare is more sort of loose and informal. In the US, important shifts have happened in the last 6 months. One of them being the government opening up telemedicine from a HIPAA compliance perspective. So earlier, there were too many rigid regulations that prevented a Zoom call happening between a physician and a patient.
Right.
It was not permitted because of some arcane way in which the HIPAA and security norms were defined. Now, the US government has opened up Zoom, WebEx, Microsoft Teams, a bunch of technologies to allow telemedicine to happen. Secondly, they made it mandatory for insurance companies to cover telemedicine as part of their bouquet of services that need to get covered. Thirdly, consumers and physicians have now started doing telemedicine, so they've suddenly got used to it. So I was not very comfortable with using video on Zoom, but now if I do it 4, 5, 10 times, then I become really familiar and comfortable with it. So now consumer behavior and physician behavior is permitting telemedicine to happen. So, and of course there is, improvement in bandwidth and 4G and all that kind of stuff, right? That is happening. So a combination of all this, I think the telemedicine is going to peak. Now, is it a huge business opportunity for City Estate? The answer is yes. But, at the end of the day, a digital innovation in general is an important theme. Telemedicine, remote patient monitoring, a whole bunch of those affiliated technologies and capabilities are going to become very important. So that is a big thrust area for City Estate. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. And I think my friend Sudeep who asked this question, I think he was very curious to know how you, I think you're right. I mean, every new opportunity presents its own opportunities for yourself. Okay, folks, we're now at 6 o'clock. So I am going to open up, and anybody who wants to come online and ask for a question, we still have 10 minutes, which I've requested Rizwan to spend an additional 10 minutes. But before I do that, especially for people who might leave, just want to summarize a little in the sense that, what you've heard is a classic entrepreneurial success story. I mean, many of us, and I think there are almost 1 million plus entrepreneurs in the last 5 years who have started in India. I think we forget the basics. I mean, the basics of a great point of view, being in an industry early enough and having a differentiated idea, that is the point of view. Having a business model which makes sense. I mean, as you heard, the US business model and the 4 and the 5 parts that this one talked about, I think it's as special as it gets. Third is funding. I mean, don't raise funding too early, which as you can really see in this, you've clearly seen that. And they raised funding even when they didn't need it. I mean, the primary funding required in the business ever. So I think that's a fantastic place to be in. And of course, the team, as he said, initially maybe a very local team, and then you keep adding people from the core market. So I think it's a fabulous story, and I think we all can probably do well to learn from that. And of course, Rizwan himself, as you can see, is the entrepreneur extraordinary, because I always say that, look, in terms of sheer intellect, coming up with a very, very specific point of view of what we should be, what we shouldn't be, and being very articulate and very passionate about it. I think that's for me, Rizwan. So Rizwan, thank you, and I'll come back again after 10 minutes and say thank you. But in the meantime, can we open up the, if anybody wants to ask a face-to-face question?
Sure. So anybody who wants to ask a question, if you can.
And while they're thinking about it, Rizwan, there's an interesting question from Ujwala who says that, look, do you think there'll be any new policy changes in healthcare in the US that will either positively or negatively affect the City Estate business?
So there are lots of things happening in US healthcare at this point, right? So one of the biggest changes that is happening is something which is broadly, and you can Google it, called value-based care. And what exactly is value-based care? Today, if you look at just historically, right, the way insurance companies compensate doctors is on a basis which is just fee for service. You do a procedure, you get paid. You do a scan, you get paid. You do a consult, you get paid, right? That is called fee for service. The doctor doesn't take any responsibility for cost containment. The doctor actually has very little incentive to looking at the total cost of care. So increasingly, the relationship between the provider and the payer is moving from a fee for service model to a value delivered model, where they're creating incentives for doctors to track the total cost of the patient, or maybe in many cases the population, and take responsibility for that. So that is a huge change in the commercial model. Now, what you should appreciate is that for doctors now, they never needed IT tools to track the performance of the fully loaded cost of the patient and the care being delivered, and which drugs were working with what efficacy levels and what was the cost of those medicines and all of that. Now in this new world, they need technologies and IT systems and analytics and reporting to be able to do all of that, right? Otherwise, they cannot have a smart contractual discussion between a hospital system and an insurance company. So it is that, it may sound simplistic, but it actually changes the fundamental premise of how healthcare is getting delivered and the technology and the tools required for you to deliver it.
One of the CEOs on the chat was saying that, look, do you think healthcare in the US could become very protectionist and they could completely ban all offshoring? Is that a likely?
I don't even think it's a point of discussion. I mean, it's not, healthcare has so many other problems in US which need to get fixed, that the fact that some of the entities are doing offshore doesn't even make it to their list of priorities, is my sense, okay? It's a crazy world. Crazy things happen. But
And anyway, you're not moving any data offshore.
We are not moving data. We are more of a tech company. If I were in the BPO space, then probably a little bit more risk. But even that, I won't worry about it, because interestingly, during COVID, okay, I've seen greater openness for healthcare organizations to say, "Oh my God, we're getting screwed financially. Are we using all the levers that we have to manage our costs?" And offshore is becoming increasingly a part of the vocabulary, even if it's not actually starting to happen. But people are starting to talk about it, which is a great first sign, in my mind. Yeah.
Absolutely. So Naveen, anybody wants to ask a question physically?
Just raise your hand and we'll unmute you, folks, if he wants to.
So BN wants to ask the question. I have unmuted him.
Sure. Go ahead.
You can go ahead.
Go ahead, VM. You're still on mute.
I think
So
Maybe we can just ask him to type his question and we can take it up there.
Yeah, I know.
I'll ask Parry to ask the question. So I have unmuted Parry.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Mr. Koida. I'm an entrepreneur. We are an IT product company, started 3.5 years back. And during COVID, we pivoted and started everything online. Now, interestingly, our business in India has stagnated and we are getting a lot of interesting opportunities. We just did 6 customers in Africa. Now, my question is, US is the holy grail, right?
Yeah.
So just guide us. How do we start? US is where I want to be. How do we start?
Actually, this is a very tricky situation that you are in, right? You are winning customers in a region where which is different from your primary market. Yeah. So now you have to make a hard trade-off between being opportunistic and showing up in Africa. And Africa is a continent, right? It's not a country. So I don't know, maybe if you're lucky, all the 6 are from the same country. If you're not, they're all from six different countries. Then you're really screwed.
There's 6 countries though. so just one point. For us, frankly, geography doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So I would say US is my primary market, not India per se.
Yeah. So, see, as a product company, you are at some point, right? I don't know what your product is, but you need to do some heavy lifting in sales, marketing, branding, promotions, and all of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the question that you'll have to ask yourself is that you're going to have finite amount of dollars with you in your pocket.
Yeah.
So are you going to be driven by what came your way? So, it just so happened that, 6 different entities from six different countries in Africa showed interest and therefore Africa becomes an important market? Or do you say that, no, I'm going to go by first principles and say that if indeed US is really a market where my product has a certain value proposition, then I'm going to hunker down and just focus on the US market.
Right.
Because the risk you run is that, it can be very distracting to start now, because each country will have its own nuances. I don't know what your product does, but if there are at least country-specific nuances, requirements, right? A product company seldom makes a product and then keeps on selling it, right? There are lots of feature enhancement requests and there's a product roadmap and there will be lots. Now, African customers may have different product enhancement needs and compliance requirements and feature requests than US customers will have, right?
Sure.
So now at some point, 6 months, a year down the line, you'll again not only have a problem that you need to make a trade-off in your marketing dollars and your sales efforts, but also from a engineering perspective, are you going to prioritize your feature sets requested by your African customers, or you're going to build more and more integration with what the American customer requirements are? So, that's a hard question for you to answer.
I completely understand, and I have answers to that also, but I don't want to hog all the time.
Yes.
Just one precise answer if I could get. If US is my primary target, where do I start in terms of BD?
What I've learned, and again, I don't know whether this is helpful for you or not, right?
Sure.
And COVID will impact this, unfortunately. We found that cost of sales is a really big factor for any entrepreneur and for any startup, right?
True.
And the problem with the US is it's so large, right? That imagine you show up in New York and you have 4 customer meetings,
Mm-hmm.
Okay, one is in San Francisco, one is in Chicago, one is in Dallas, and one is in New York. Now you're again screwed because now you're flying all over the world and all over a big continent, right? Trying to do one-on-one meetings. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What we found is conferences in many industries. There are important conferences. So at Citius Tech, and we didn't get into detail, we have mechanized the process of how do you create sales opportunities from conferences.
I see.
And so you identify which conference is relevant.
That Rizwan deserves a separate webinar. That's what
it's a
everything
separate webinar. I can do a separate webinar only on that, in some ways, right? That how do you reduce your cost of sale, right? By maximizing the number of productive client engagements you can do without having to fly all over the US, okay? Yeah. And if your industry has a conference, right, then milking that conference is basically your key success factor.
Sure. Heard that before. Thanks so much.
Yeah, no, that is a good question. Thank you. Okay, so finally, last question to you, Rizwan. So, I mean, if you do crystal ball gazing and say, look, 10 years later, Rizwan is still a young man, and
I'm not that young, but
that
yes,
time you've listed at a $10 billion valuation, made all the money you can for the next 7 generations. If there is one more gig you would do, what sector would you choose?
Right now?
No, 5 years from now. Or now, for that matter.
So, my instinctive bias is always to look at sectors which are very painful there. Because, which are very, very painful. There is no easy answer to that question. So, for example, right, I've always wondered, right, how do you, and again, this is like a random point, okay? If somebody can think of an idea in this space, then all power to you, okay? The traffic problem in India is going to get even worse, right? There are some amazingly bright people who are stuck for hours in traffic every day. And when they're stuck in traffic, now there is mobile and all of that, they can check mail and everything, but otherwise they're largely not. Are there workflow tools that you can do to make people gainfully occupied and productive in traffic?
And cause more.
That's an example. Huh?
And cause more traffic accidents.
No, you're not usually driving. I'm talking about the segment, where you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're a physician, you're whatever, right? Whatever. But, increasingly, iPad and all of these. So that's sort of one broad area. The other broad area is healthcare, in some ways, healthcare, education, lots of those things. What I find is, Ganesh, is, and again, this may be an unfair comment. It probably applies to the very young generation, right? In some ways, okay? The people who are graduating from colleges, who are like super motivated to be entrepreneurs, okay? They understand the easy problems of life very well, right? So they know that, if you want to buy flowers, then there was no flowers.com in India. If you want to buy food, then lots of food things, right? Many of our young folks, right? They don't have a deep understanding of some of the big problems in India because they haven't had the chance to engage there. Like for example, right? Today in India, one of the biggest agitations that are happening is about the government changes in the mandi and the taxes on mandis versus whatever, so that people can. I mean, can you imagine the entrepreneurial opportunity to take that one government change in regulation and create $1 billion business out of it? Yeah. Now the problem is that if you're an urban engineering grad who's just got out of college, right? You've never seen a mandi in your life, yeah. And you don't understand the business dynamics of a farmer or the mandi operator to know that अरे ये change हो गया तो हमने अगर ये बना दिया tool तो इसके कारण हमारा बड़ा business बन सकता है. It need not be a tech tool. It could be whatever, maybe the business, right? So those are real problems in India, which are very complicated problems, but with massive opportunities. But somebody has to take that passion and drive and spend maybe 1 or 2 years understanding that problem before you can do something about it. In some ways.
What you're saying is beyond the Atmanirbhar Bharat.
Don't. If you're a smart guy, don't build another TikTok, or a scanning application. That's too simple to do. There are 1,000 other people trying to do that, right? Go and spend 3 months in a mandi and just see how it works there. Or go to a primary health center in a district and just see the utmost chaos there. Okay, and what can you do to solve that people's problem there? I think those are the areas with lots of opportunities.
I think Niti Aayog with Ayushman Bharat have already tried that one.
Yeah.
Great. So thank you very much. I mean, we could
Okay, thank you
probably-
very much. Yeah, it was a
I
pleasure, Ganesh, talking to you. And
It was
for
as good
everyone,
as I
hope you guys-
expected, as good as I expected and better. So it's always
Yeah.
fun talking to you.
Yeah.
Back to you, Naveen.
Thank you, Rizwan. So, folks, let me tell you that this is just going to be part one of Rizwan because many questions yet unanswered. So I think we'll come back to you in a fortnight time, and let's go more into
This will
details.
be the Rizwan series on Netflix
Yeah.
style.
No. I can assure you, everybody's going to get really bored very quickly. Yeah. I should end on a high point. Yeah.
So the other thing also, Rizwan, is that Time Mumbai, we have now started reinvigorating our special interest group for healthcare. So we're getting a bunch of healthcare and health tech entrepreneurs coming together. So I think we'll kind of pull you into that, and we've got a lot to do on that front. And especially in the last 5 months, I think all the healthcare, health tech entrepreneurs have also got a boost. And so I think we need experts like you who can kind of come, think, and envision a lot of stuff for them. So we'll take you up on that. Thank you all for joining us today. Just before we leave, I would also like to talk about 2 more things that are going to happen tomorrow and coming soon. So tomorrow we are going to be doing a session on personality traits that an entrepreneur needs to have. So we've got a psychiatrist in the name of Dr. Ragini Rao, who's going to be looking at your personality traits, and this is almost like a workshop session, which she's going to be. It's not to say whether one personality beats the other. It's basically also she's going to look at your personality traits and say, hey, you know what? There's a lot more that you can do with what you have currently. And for folks who are on the HNI side and who want to, put your money where you can get bang for your buck, Sanjay Mehta is going to be doing a complete session on venture investing. This is going to be a 16-weekend program where I think he's going to be taking you through classes on how to invest, how to think through your theses, how do you look at opportunities, how do you think through tech, all of that. So these are the programs coming up. So please do subscribe and join us. And having said that, back to you, Ganesh, and thanks a ton, Rizwan. We'll get in touch with you, and we want to do more of these such sessions.
Absolutely. Thank you all. It was a wonderful day. Have a good weekend, folks, and stay safe.
Right, thanks. Thanks, Naveen. Thanks, Ganesh. Fun session. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Rizwan. Bye.
Thank you.